Cold War did not begin with a declaration. It did not end with a surrender. There was no armistice, no ceremony, no single moment when one side laid down its weapons and acknowledged defeat. What there was, instead, was a slow accumulation of tension so dense and so prolonged that entire governments, entire military apparatuses, entire generations of scientists and strategists became organized around the management of a conflict that could never actually be fought. That is the first thing you need to understand. Not that it was cold in the sense of calm or restrained, but that it was cold in the sense of something suspended, something held just below the threshold of release, something that never fully became what it was always threatening to become. And in that suspension, across 46 years of alerts and deployments and protocol revisions and near-catastrophes that were never reported, and decisions made in basements by men whose names appeared on no ballot, the world came closer to ending than most people who lived through it ever knew. We have been told a version of this history that emphasizes stability. The deterrence worked, we are told. The logic of mutual assured destruction held. Rational actors on both sides understood the stakes and stepped back from the edge. And there is some truth in that version. But it is a truth that omits the accidents. It omits the false alarms. It omits the nights when a single radar operator or a single software error or a single submarine commander held in his hands the question of whether civilization continued. It omits the systems that were designed to launch without waiting for human confirmation. It omits the documents that remained classified for decades precisely because their contents would have made the idea of managed stability impossible to believe. This is a record of 20 facts about the Cold War that historians who have spent careers studying this period still find difficult to fully absorb, not because the facts are obscure, though many were buried for a long time, but because each one, taken seriously, dismantles the comfortable narrative that the world was being governed wisely, that the people in charge understood what they were doing, and that survival was the result of policy rather than chance. The first fact concerns a morning in October of 1962, at the height of what most people know as the Cuban Missile Crisis. An American U-2 reconnaissance plane on a routine mission over the Arctic drifted off course. It entered Soviet airspace. Soviet fighter jets scrambled to intercept it. American fighter jets scrambled in response, some of them armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles, because that was standard practice at the time. The U-2 pilot eventually found his way back to Alaska, but for a period that lasted well over an hour, Soviet air defense commanders were tracking an unidentified American aircraft deep inside their territory during the most dangerous nuclear standoff in history, and American commanders were watching Soviet fighters converging on one of their planes. Neither side fired, but neither side's leadership in Washington or Moscow knew this incident was happening while it was happening. Kennedy was not informed until it was over. Khrushchev received his briefing with a delay. The two men who were at that moment engaged in the most careful diplomatic back-channel in history, measuring every word, calculating every signal, were simultaneously unaware that their militaries had already created a situation that could have ended the negotiations before they concluded. The incident was classified. It did not appear in the official historical record for years, and when it finally did, it arrived as a footnote. The second fact concerns a system that the United States military developed during the late 1950s and continued to refine throughout the Cold War. It was called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, and it was a nuclear war plan of a kind that had never existed before and has rarely been discussed with full honesty since. The plan, in its early versions, called for the simultaneous delivery of nuclear weapons against every significant population center, military installation, and industrial facility in the Soviet Union, China, and the Eastern Bloc, together, at the same time, in one strike. The casualty estimates produced by the plan's architects, estimates that were shared with the Joint Chiefs and with senior civilian leadership, projected that this single coordinated attack would kill between 300 and 425 million people within the first months. This was not a worst-case scenario, this was the plan. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was first briefed on it in 1961, he reportedly left the room and said nothing for a long time. He later described the experience as one of the most disturbing of his professional life. The plan was eventually revised, scaled, and subdivided into options with less catastrophic footprints. But the underlying logic, the idea that a nuclear response would be total rather than targeted, remained embedded in American warfighting doctrine for the entirety of the Cold War, and the targeting databases built from it are among the most carefully guarded documents in American military history. The third fact concerns a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov, whose story did not become widely known until the 1990s, and who received no official recognition from the Soviet government during his lifetime. On September 26, 1983, Petrov was the duty officer at a Soviet nuclear early warning facility outside Moscow. The early warning system reported the launch of one American intercontinental ballistic missile. Then it reported a second, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. The system classified the alert as the highest possible level of certainty. Protocol required Petrov to report the launch to his superiors, who would have then initiated the Soviet retaliatory response. Petrov did not report it. He made a judgment, in the span of a few minutes, with no supporting data and no way to verify his reasoning, that the alert was a false alarm. His reasoning was not technical, it was intuitive. He later said that a real first strike would not involve 5 missiles. If the Americans were going to launch, they would launch everything. The alert, he concluded, did not match the pattern of genuine intent. He was right. The alert was produced by a satellite malfunction involving sunlight reflecting off clouds in a way the system had not been programmed to filter. Petrov's decision, made alone, in a room with seconds available, prevented the Soviet military from receiving a launch confirmation that might have produced a retaliatory strike against the United States before anyone in Washington knew what had happened. He was reprimanded for improperly filling out his logbook. He was quietly reassigned. He never received a commendation. The incident was classified until the Soviet Union dissolved. The fourth fact concerns a weapon system so dangerous that even its designers eventually concluded it should never have been built. In the 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in nuclear-armed surface-to-air missiles designed to destroy incoming bomber formations. The American version, known as the Bomark, was deployed across the northern United States and Canada. It carried a nuclear warhead. Its purpose was to detonate in the vicinity of Soviet bombers, destroying them with the blast radius of a nuclear explosion. This meant that if Soviet bombers appeared in American airspace, the American response would involve detonating nuclear weapons over American and Canadian territory. The fallout from these detonations, the blast effects, the electromagnetic pulse, would have impacted American cities, American infrastructure, and American civilians. The system was operational for years before this implication received serious internal examination. A 1960 accident at a Bomark storage facility in New Jersey, in which a missile caught fire and its conventional explosives detonated, scattering plutonium across a contaminated area that took decades and hundreds of millions of dollars to partially remediate, brought the question of safety into sharper focus. But the deeper question, the question of whether a weapon designed to protect the country by detonating nuclear warheads above the country made coherent strategic sense, was never resolved. The system was eventually decommissioned, quietly, without public explanation. The fifth fact involves a submarine. In October 1962, as the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its most acute phase, an American naval task force located a Soviet submarine near the quarantine line the United States had established around Cuba. The submarine, designated B-59, had been out of communication with Moscow for days. Its crew did not know whether war had already begun. The submarine was being harassed by American destroyers using practice depth charges, a signal intended to force the submarine to surface. Inside B-59, conditions were severe. The air recycling system had broken down. Temperatures in the vessel had reached above 120 degrees Fahrenheit in some compartments. Carbon dioxide levels were rising. Several crew members had lost consciousness. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, believed his vessel was under attack and that a war had started. He ordered the submarine's nuclear torpedo armed and prepared for launch. The nuclear torpedo carried a warhead with a yield comparable to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. On a Soviet submarine, the authority to launch a nuclear weapon required the agreement of the captain, the political officer, and a third officer. The captain and the political officer both agreed. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued under conditions of extreme physical and psychological stress in a vessel that was flooding with carbon dioxide and had been without reliable communication for days that they could not be certain war had begun. The torpedo was not launched. The submarine eventually surfaced. Archipov's role in this incident was not publicly confirmed until 2002. The sixth fact concerns the way in which the American nuclear arsenal was, for a significant portion of the Cold War, technically available to a much wider range of actors than the official command and control narrative suggests. In the early years of nuclear deployment, before the development of sophisticated authorization systems, there were American nuclear weapons stationed at bases across Europe, Asia, and the continental United States that could be armed and delivered by base commanders acting without direct authorization from the President or the Secretary of Defense. The authorization codes, known as permissive action links, were introduced gradually through the 1960s and 1970s. Before they were universally implemented, and in some cases long after they were supposedly in place, the practical barriers to unauthorized nuclear use were sometimes procedural rather than technical. Congressional investigations in the 1970s found instances in which the codes designed to prevent unauthorized launch were set to strings of repeated zeros, because field commanders found the actual security codes inconvenient to manage under operational conditions. This was not a rogue decision by a single commander. It was a widespread accommodation to operational practicality, and it persisted for years. The documents confirming this practice were declassified slowly, in pieces, over the course of decades. The seventh fact involves a place called perimeter, which is the name sometimes used in Western sources for a Soviet system that Russian officials have periodically confirmed exists, and whose full capabilities and current operational status remain unclear. The system, developed in the late 1970s and reportedly made operational around 1985, was designed to address a specific Soviet vulnerability. Soviet leadership feared a decapitating American first strike, an attack precise and fast enough to destroy the entire Soviet command structure before a retaliatory order could be issued. Perimeter was the answer. It was a system designed to detect the signs of a nuclear attack and, in the event that Soviet command communications had gone silent, to issue a launch order without requiring confirmation from surviving leadership. The system would confirm, through seismic sensors and radiation detectors and communication monitoring, that a nuclear attack had taken place. It would then verify that the central command structure was not responding, and if both conditions were met, it could initiate the launch of Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles autonomously. The deterrent logic was clear. Even if the United States destroyed every Soviet leader and every Soviet command facility in the first seconds of a war, the missiles would still launch. There would be no decapitation that stopped the retaliation. But the system also meant that the decision to end civilization was, under certain conditions, not a human decision at all. It was a decision made by sensors and software in a bunker, responding to inputs that no living person was confirming in real time. Western analysts who became aware of the system in the late 1980s and through documents that emerged after the Soviet collapse found it deeply unsettling, not because it was irrational by the logic of deterrence, but because it was entirely rational by that logic, and that rationality itself was the problem. The eighth fact concerns a crisis that preceded the Cuban Missile Crisis by 3 years and that received almost no public attention at the time and has received relatively little historical attention since. In 1958 and 1959, a confrontation over the status of Berlin escalated to a point where American military planners began preparing operational plans for a nuclear strike against Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. The trigger scenario involved a potential Soviet move to cut off Western access to West Berlin. American planners concluded that conventional military options for defending the access corridors were insufficient, and that if the Soviets moved, the escalation path led within a manageable number of steps to nuclear use. Eisenhower, reviewing these plans, was disturbed by how quickly the analysis arrived at nuclear options and by how few non-nuclear alternatives had been seriously developed. He began pressing the military to expand the range of conventional responses available. The military's response was largely to argue that conventional options would be inadequate and that the credibility of the nuclear deterrent depended on its being genuinely available for use. The Berlin crisis of 1958 did not produce a military confrontation, but the planning that accompanied it revealed to those who reviewed it internally that the gap between a political standoff and a nuclear exchange was smaller than the public narrative of managed deterrence suggested. The ninth fact involves a man named Robert McNamara and a series of conversations he had decades after leaving office with the former Cuban leadership and with former Soviet officials who had been involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. McNamara, who had been Secretary of Defense during the crisis, spent the later decades of his life engaged in what he called a retrospective study of the crisis, meeting with the people on the other side to reconstruct what had actually happened. What he learned, he later said, changed his understanding of how close the world had come. He learned that Soviet forces in Cuba in October 1962 had tactical nuclear weapons already deployed on the island, weapons whose existence American intelligence had not confirmed. He learned that Soviet commanders in Cuba had authority, under certain conditions, to use those weapons without waiting for authorization from Moscow. He learned about the submarine B-59 and about how close the nuclear torpedo had come to being launched. And he concluded, in a series of public statements and in a documentary film made toward the end of his life, that the survival of civilization during the Cuban Missile Crisis had depended not on the wisdom of the decision-makers or on the logic of deterrence, but on luck. He was precise about this. He said luck. He said that what he had learned in his retrospective study had convinced him that the crisis had been survived through chance rather than through management, and that this conclusion should terrify anyone who believed the logic of nuclear deterrence was a reliable guarantor of safety. The 10th fact concerns a nuclear bomb that was accidentally dropped on the United States. In January 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying 2 Mark 39 nuclear bombs broke apart in flight over Goldsboro, North Carolina. Both bombs fell from the aircraft. One fell into a field and was recovered relatively intact. The other bomb completed several of the arming steps during its fall. Investigators found that 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms on the second bomb had failed or had been bypassed by the stress of the fall. The 4th mechanism, a single low-voltage switch, remained intact, and it was that switch that prevented detonation. The bomb had a yield of 3 to 4 megatons. The city of Goldsboro had a population at the time of around 20,000 people. Raleigh was 50 miles away. The document describing the incident was classified for decades. When it was finally released in partially redacted form in 2013, following a Freedom of Information Act request, the phrase used by one of the investigators to describe how close detonation had come was that they had been, by the narrowest of margins, saved by a single switch. There had been other accidents involving nuclear weapons before this incident and after it. There had been accidents in Spain, in Greenland, in the Pacific, in storage facilities in transit. The full inventory of these accidents remains partially classified. The accidents that are known were the result of mechanical failure, navigational error, miscommunication, and the inherent physical instability of transporting weapons whose yields were measured in millions of tons of conventional explosive. The 11th fact concerns the organizational logic of how nuclear alert posture was managed throughout the Cold War, and what that logic revealed about the relationship between human decision-making and institutional momentum. By the mid-1960s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed elaborate systems for maintaining a significant portion of their nuclear forces in a state of continuous readiness for launch on short notice. American bombers were kept in continuous airborne alert patterns. Submarines were continuously on patrol. Land-based missiles were maintained at readiness levels that allowed launch within minutes of receiving an order. This posture was not simply a military decision. It was an institutional commitment built into procurement, into training, into career advancement, into the entire organizational culture of the forces responsible for maintaining it. Reducing the alert posture, stepping down from high readiness to lower readiness, required overcoming institutional resistance that went far beyond the objections of individual commanders. It required confronting the entire professional identity of organizations whose reason for existing was their ability to respond immediately and massively. The alert posture itself became a source of organizational legitimacy, and the legitimacy of the organizations that maintained it became a barrier to reconsidering whether the posture made sense. When civilian leaders attempted to reduce alert levels or to introduce measures that would slow the path from warning to launch, they encountered resistance not through insubordination, but through procedural complexity, through the language of operational necessity, through the accumulated inertia of decades of institutional commitment to immediate readiness. The 12th fact involves a war that was almost started by a military exercise. In November 1983, NATO conducted a command exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to simulate the process of escalating through various stages of alert to the actual release of nuclear weapons. It was realistic in detail, involving genuine communication procedures, genuine command protocols, and a scenario that moved through the stages of NATO's nuclear release process, step by step. Soviet intelligence, observing the exercise through signals intercepts and human sources, could not determine with certainty whether the exercise was a cover for an actual attack. The Soviet military moved forces to higher states of readiness. Nuclear-armed aircraft in Eastern Europe were placed on alert. The KGB sent urgent messages to its stations in Western capitals, asking for any indication that a surprise attack was being prepared. The Soviet leadership during this period was led by Yuri Andropov, who was gravely ill, who had recently authorized the shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 007, whose intelligence services had just concluded an assessment that American rhetoric about nuclear war indicated genuine intent, and who was personally more concerned about the risk of a sudden American first strike than any Soviet leader since the early Cold War. When the exercise concluded without incident, Soviet forces stood down. But the intelligence reports generated by the Soviet response to Able Archer 83, when they were reviewed by American analysts in the weeks following the exercise, produced genuine alarm. A President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board report in 1990, partially declassified, concluded that the Soviet response to Able Archer had been more serious than had been understood at the time, and that the United States had come closer to a nuclear exchange in November 1983 than it had realized. The 13th fact concerns the way in which the development of nuclear weapons intersected with the American governmental system in ways that created accountability gaps that have never been fully closed. In the early years of nuclear development, the extreme secrecy surrounding the Manhattan Project and its successor programs produced a situation in which the most consequential weapons ever built were being managed outside the normal structures of democratic oversight. The Atomic Energy Commission, which had civilian oversight over nuclear weapons development in the post-war years, operated with a level of independence that gave it enormous power over decisions with unlimited consequences. The military services competed for control over nuclear weapons delivery systems in ways that produced redundancy, waste, and on several occasions, genuinely dangerous operational practices, because no single authority had comprehensive oversight. Congressional oversight was limited by classification. Presidential oversight was limited by the sheer volume and technical complexity of the decisions being made. The result was a system in which accountability for the most dangerous technology in human history was distributed across multiple bureaucratic entities, none of which had complete knowledge of what the others were doing, and none of which had the authority to impose a coherent and consistent set of safety and operational standards across the entire enterprise. The 14th fact concerns a nuclear test program whose scale and whose effects on the people who lived near test sites have been acknowledged only gradually and incompletely. Between 1945 and 1992, the United States conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests, the majority of them at the Nevada test site and in the Pacific. The Soviet Union conducted over 700 tests. The United Kingdom, France, and China conducted additional tests. The people who lived downwind of the Nevada test site were exposed to radioactive fallout from hundreds of atmospheric tests. Studies conducted in the 1990s and later found elevated rates of thyroid cancer and leukemia among populations in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. The populations of the Marshall Islands, where the United States conducted high-yield tests, including the 1954 Castle Bravo test, whose yield exceeded its design specifications by a factor of more than 2, were evacuated repeatedly, exposed to fallout, and in some cases permanently displaced from their home islands. The crew of a Japanese fishing vessel, the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, was contaminated by fallout from Castle Bravo while operating in waters outside the exclusion zone. The nuclear testing programs produced, across their entire scope, a global distribution of radioactive contamination whose public health consequences have been the subject of scientific debate for decades and whose full accounting remains contested. The institutional response to evidence of harm was, in virtually all cases, to challenge the evidence, to classify the data, and to prioritize the continuation of the testing program over the protection of affected populations. The 15th fact involves a crisis that took place entirely within Soviet command structures and that demonstrates how the logic of Cold War paranoia could operate as a self-reinforcing system. In 1981, the Soviet intelligence services, acting under a directive from Soviet leadership, began an intelligence-gathering program known as Operation Ryan, an acronym for the Russian phrase meaning nuclear missile attack. The program was designed to detect signs that the United States was preparing for a surprise nuclear first strike. The indicators the program was told to monitor included the levels of light in American government buildings late at night, the number of limousines parked outside key facilities, blood supplies at hospitals near government centers, the operational status of civil defense preparations. Soviet intelligence officers at stations across the Western world were tasked with reporting on these indicators regularly. The program operated from a set of assumptions that were not explicitly stated, but that shaped everything it collected. The assumption that an American first strike was not only possible, but was being actively planned. The assumption that the Soviet Union was vulnerable to such a strike, and the assumption that the indicators being monitored would actually reveal preparation for a strike if one were being planned. None of these assumptions was subjected to systematic scrutiny. The result was a program that generated enormous amounts of raw intelligence about normal Western government activity, filtered through the expectation of finding evidence of hostile intent, and that periodically produced assessments that elevated the Soviet leadership's sense of danger without providing any genuine insight into American intentions. The program continued for years, feeding the institutional paranoia that made incidents like the Soviet response to Able Archer possible. The 16th fact concerns a technology that fundamentally changed the strategic balance of the Cold War, and whose introduction was managed with a level of institutional secrecy that prevented rational public debate about its implications. Multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, known by the acronym MIRVs, allowed a single ballistic missile to carry multiple nuclear warheads, each of which could be directed to a separate target. The technology was developed in the late 1960s and deployed on American missiles beginning in 1970. The Soviet Union developed and deployed its own MERV capability through the 1970s. The introduction of MIRVs meant that the number of warheads in existence multiplied rapidly, even as the number of delivery vehicles remained relatively stable. It also changed the strategic calculation in a destabilizing direction. A single missile with 10 warheads could, in theory, destroy 10 enemy missiles, each of which also carried multiple warheads. This arithmetic created strong incentives to strike first, to destroy the enemy's missiles before they could be launched, because the ratio of warheads expended to warheads destroyed favored the attacker. Arms control analysts who understood this dynamic attempted to explain it to policymakers throughout the 1970s, arguing that MERV technology was inherently destabilizing and that its spread would make crisis stability harder to maintain. The institutional momentum behind the technology was too great. The military services that operated the delivery systems wanted them. The contractors that built the warheads wanted to build more. The strategic arguments against MIRVs were technically correct and institutionally irrelevant. The 17th fact involves the physical reality of what nuclear weapons do and the gap between that reality and the language used to manage nuclear policy throughout the Cold War. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima killed between 70 and 80,000 people immediately. The blast produced burns, crush injuries, and blunt trauma across a radius of roughly 2 kilometers from the hypocenter. Fires generated by the thermal pulse merged into a firestorm. People who survived the initial blast and who had been in reinforced structures emerged to find a city that no longer existed. The medical infrastructure required to treat the injured had been destroyed along with everything else. The social infrastructure required to organize any response had been destroyed. The long-term effects, the cancers, the genetic damage, the psychological trauma, the total disruption of family and community structures continued to affect the survivor population for the remainder of their lives. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima had a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. The warheads deployed on American and Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles during the height of the Cold War had yields measured in hundreds of kilotons, in some cases in megatons. The language used to discuss these weapons in policy documents, yield, throw weight, circular error probable, damage expectancy, did not describe what these weapons would do to the human populations against whom they would be used. It described physical and mechanical properties abstracted entirely from the experience of dying in a nuclear fire. This language was not accidental. It was developed precisely because the alternative, describing nuclear policy in terms of what nuclear weapons actually do to human beings, would have made many of the policies being discussed impossible to maintain. The 18th fact concerns the extent to which Cold War nuclear planning assumed civilian casualties on a scale that no historical precedent could have prepared decision-makers to manage. The targeting databases maintained by both superpowers were built around military, industrial, and political targets. But the weapons designed to hit those targets were large enough that their blast and fallout effects would extend far beyond any military or industrial facility. The city of Moscow was, in American war plans, a target. The Soviet capital was surrounded by defensive missile systems and hardened command bunkers. To destroy or suppress those military assets required detonating weapons whose blast radii encompassed tens of millions of people. American planners knew this. Soviet planners targeting American cities knew this. The term used in planning documents was collateral damage, which was technically accurate as a description of casualties incurred in the vicinity of a target that was not itself a civilian population center, and which was simultaneously one of the most precise examples of language being used to make the unthinkable manageable. The planning documents that have been partially declassified reveal a world in which the deaths of tens of millions of civilians in nuclear exchanges were categorized, quantified, and subjected to cost-benefit analysis, because the alternative to treating them analytically was to confront them morally. And the institutions responsible for maintaining nuclear deterrence were not built to conduct moral confrontations. They were built to conduct planning cycles. The 19th fact involves the Soviet nuclear program's relationship with its own internal culture of secrecy and the consequences of that culture for safety. The Soviet Union built and deployed nuclear weapons under conditions of classification so extreme that information about accidents, design flaws, and safety failures was routinely withheld not only from the public, but from the technical and military personnel who needed it to operate safely. The 1986 explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which used reactor technology that shared design lineage with Soviet military plutonium production reactors, was in part the consequence of safety information having been suppressed or ignored within a system that prioritized secrecy over the dissemination of corrective information. But before Chernobyl, the Soviet military nuclear program had experienced accidents whose scale and nature were hidden from international awareness for decades. A 1957 explosion at the Mayak plutonium production facility in the Ural Mountains released radioactive contamination across an area comparable in scale to the Chernobyl event. The contaminated area was evacuated. The local population was relocated. The incident was classified, and for nearly 3 decades, it was not acknowledged. The contamination remained. Soviet military nuclear submarines experienced reactor accidents, fires, and sinkings throughout the Cold War. Several Soviet nuclear submarines were lost with their reactors and in some cases their nuclear weapons at depths from which recovery was impossible. The pattern of institutional suppression that surrounded these incidents was not simply a feature of Soviet authoritarianism. It was a feature of the nuclear military enterprise as a whole on both sides. The American military had its own culture of institutional suppression around nuclear accidents, and many of the documents revealing the extent of that suppression were released only after Freedom of Information Act requests or after the expiration of classification timelines that stretched across decades. The 20th fact is perhaps the most quietly disturbing of all, because it concerns not a single incident or a single system, but a structural feature of how the Cold War ended and what that ending did and did not change. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991. The Warsaw Pact had already collapsed. The ideological conflict that had structured the Cold War was over. The two blocs that had faced each other across 46 years of nuclear standoff were no longer facing each other in the same way, and yet the weapons remained. The targeting databases remained. The launch-on warning postures remained. The early warning systems remained. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction remained. The institutional cultures of the military organizations that had spent decades planning nuclear war remained substantially intact. The treaties negotiated in the years around the Soviet collapse reduced the total numbers of deployed warheads, but the reductions left both the United States and Russia with arsenals of thousands of nuclear weapons, maintained at alert levels that had not changed in their fundamental character. The command and control systems, the procedures for authorizing launch, the technical infrastructure for detecting incoming missiles, all of it continued to operate, more or less as it had before, serving a strategic relationship that had formally changed while its material foundations had not. The near misses of the Cold War, the accidents, the false alarms, the moments when an individual or a mechanical failure or a bureaucratic breakdown had brought the world to the edge of nuclear exchange, those moments had not produced a fundamental reconsideration of the architecture that made them possible. The architecture persisted. It was maintained by the same institutional logic that had built it, by the same career structures and procurement relationships and doctrinal commitments that had made it politically impossible to question during the Cold War. And the systems that had been designed to function without human judgment, the automated response systems, the hair trigger alert postures, the launch-on warning protocols, those systems continued to operate in a world that had moved on politically while remaining, in the most material sense, exactly where it had been. The Cold War ended. The infrastructure of the Cold War did not.